Have you ever noticed that curious similarity? How the most fervent atheist and the most devout believer often mirror each other in their certainty, their moral outrage, their sense of superior insight. It's one of those patterns that hides in plain sight, camouflaged by the apparent opposition of their views. The atheist who confidently proclaims, "There is absolutely no God," shares a striking psychological structure with the believer who declares, "There is absolutely a God." Both claim access to a fundamental truth about reality that transcends mere opinion. Both find a curious comfort in their absolute position. There's something almost suspicious about this symmetry, a pattern so consistent it demands deeper investigation. The anomaly extends beyond mere rhetoric. The evangelical atheist who proselytizes with religious zeal, the materialist who treats scientific theories as sacred texts, the skeptic who builds a personal identity around disbelief as firmly as any believer constructs theirs around faith, the nihilist who clings to emptiness with the same desperate certainty that others cling to fullness. In each case, the structure of belief remains even as its content inverts. There's something peculiar about this pattern, a suspicious correlation that warrants closer scrutiny. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we notice how consistently the rejection of traditional faith transforms into new forms of quasi-religious certainty. I believe in science. I trust only what can be proven. Nothing exists beyond the material world. These statements aren't simply reasoned positions but function as declarations of faith, absolute certainties that provide psychological anchor points in an otherwise uncertain existence. There's something almost too convenient about the persistence of faith structures even among those who most vehemently reject faith itself. The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. What if absolute disbelief is psychologically indistinguishable from absolute belief? What if the nihilist's conviction that nothing matters is structurally identical to the religious conviction that everything matters? What if atheism, when embraced with sufficient certainty, transforms from the absence of religion into an inverted religion of its own, complete with sacred values, moral imperatives, and absolute claims about reality? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of how we understand human psychology, intellectual honesty, and the possibility of genuine freedom of thought. If the rejection of faith can unconsciously reproduce the very psychological structures it claims to transcend, how might this affect our pursuit of truth? What might become possible if we recognize the hidden faith that often lurks within absolute disbelief? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of both religious belief and its rejection? A philosopher who dared to ask whether our most fervent denials might actually be serving very similar purposes to our most passionate affirmations? A thinker whose commitment to intellectual honesty led him to question not just faith, but the hidden faiths concealed within skepticism itself? What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind the proudest disbelief often lurks something much less rationale. The same desperate need for certainty, for finality, for absolute truth that drives religious conviction. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so difficult to recognize the faith structures hidden within disbelief? Could it be that our psychological need for certainty is so profound that it operates even in those who most pride themselves on having transcended such needs? What if the ultimate intellectual challenge isn't believing or disbelieving, but recognizing the hidden beliefs that structure even our most confident denials? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about skepticism, atheism, and intellectual freedom. They offer a perspective on disbelief not as the absence of faith, but as its subtle transformation. A perspective that might open possibilities for thinking beyond both dogmatic belief and dogmatic disbelief. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in how disbelief functions psychologically that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar correlation between the rejection of traditional faith and the emergence of new forms of quasi-religious certainty. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly in how the structures of faith persist, even as their content is inverted. Consider how atheism manifests in its more fervent forms. The absolute certainty that no divine reality exists. The moral imperative to liberate others from religious delusion. The construction of comprehensive worldviews that explain everything through material causes. The sense of belonging to an enlightened minority who see through widespread superstition. The emotional satisfaction derived from this superior insight. The pattern is remarkably consistent. The psychological structures of religious faith, certainty, meaning, moral purpose, community, emotional comfort, reappear in precisely those worldviews that most explicitly reject religion. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse contexts. Whether in scientific materialism, philosophical nihilism, political ideologies, or secular humanism, the same psychological mechanism operates. The rejection of traditional faith transforms not into the absence of faith structures, but into their reproduction in inverted form. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how it manifests in intellectual history. The most passionate atheists often display psychological profiles strikingly similar to religious fundamentalists. Certainty in their position, missionary zeal to convert others, moral indignation toward those who disagree, and the treatment of certain texts or authorities as beyond criticism. The pattern persists. The structure of faith remains even as its content inverts. The anomaly extends beyond individual psychology into cultural movements. The new atheism that emerged in the early 21st century didn't simply reject religion, but developed many religion-like features: charismatic leaders, canonical texts, communal gatherings, shared symbols and language, and a sense of moral mission. Similarly, political ideologies that explicitly reject religious frameworks often reproduce religious psychological structures. Absolute truth claims, sacred values beyond question, heresy concepts for dissenting views, and eschatological visions of future salvation, whether through revolution, technological progress, or social evolution. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss atheism, skepticism, and secularism at length, but we seldom examine this specific correlation. How consistently the rejection of faith reproduces the very psychological structures it claims to transcend. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how disbelief often functions psychologically in ways remarkably similar to belief. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that nihilism, atheism, and radical skepticism might be serving psychological functions remarkably similar to those served by religious faith. What if the confident declaration, "I believe in nothing," is structurally identical to "I believe in everything"? What if the nihilist's certainty that nothing matters is psychologically indistinguishable from the religious certainty that everything matters? This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into human psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether our most confident denials might actually be serving very similar purposes to our most passionate affirmations. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between belief and disbelief? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? What if absolute disbelief isn't the transcendence of faith, but merely its inversion? What if nihilism isn't the absence of religion, but religion's shadow? These questions lead us to Nietzsche's disturbing insight. To deny everything is still a form of belief. In the autumn of 1887, Friedrich Nietzsche was working on what would become one of his most penetrating works, The Genealogy of Morals. At 43, he was at the height of his philosophical powers, but remained almost entirely unrecognized by the intellectual establishment. His books sold poorly, sometimes fewer than 100 copies, and he lived in near isolation, moving between cheap lodgings across Europe as his meager savings allowed. His health was deteriorating, Severe migraines, stomach ailments, and failing eyesight regularly confined him to darkened rooms for days at a time. It was within this context of physical suffering and public indifference that Nietzsche formulated his most penetrating insights about the psychological foundations of both religious belief and its rejection. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point from which to examine the hidden faiths concealed within skepticism. Having grown up as the son of a Lutheran pastor in a deeply religious household, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of religious psychology from the inside. Yet his own intellectual journey had led him beyond both conventional faith and its simple negation into territory few thinkers had explored. The recognition that disbelief often reproduces the very psychological structures it claims to transcend. What made Nietzsche's perspective on nihilism especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Here was a man who had moved beyond both naive faith and naive atheism into more complex terrain. Each day, as he navigated both his physical pain and his intellectual isolation, Nietzsche lived the very question at the heart of his philosophy. Is it possible to think beyond both dogmatic belief and dogmatic disbelief into territory where the mind observes reality without the comfort of absolute positions? During his solitary walks through alpine landscapes, taken during periods of relative physical relief, Nietzsche contemplated the psychological function of nihilism. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how consistently the rejection of traditional faith transformed not into the absence of faith structures, but into their reproduction in inverted form. The passionate atheist, the committed nihilist, the radical skeptic, each often displayed psychological profiles strikingly similar to the religious believers they most criticized, characterized by certainty, moral fervor, and missionary zeal. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to develop what would become one of his most disturbing insights: that nihilism wasn't simply the absence of belief, but a particular kind of belief, a faith in nothingness that functioned psychologically in ways remarkably similar to religious faith. As he would write in a fragment later published in The Will to Power, nihilism represents the ultimate logical conclusion of our great values and ideals, because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value these values really had. This wasn't merely philosophical wordplay, but profound psychological insight. The nihilist's conviction that nothing matters is structurally identical to the religious conviction that everything matters. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from abstract theorizing, but from Nietzsche's own observations of how disbelief functioned in both intellectual history and contemporary society. He noticed how the most passionate atheists of his era, figures like Ludwig Feuerbach and David Strauss, reproduced many religious psychological structures, even as they rejected religious content. Their atheism wasn't simply the absence of faith, but a particular kind of inverted faith, characterized by certainty, moral purpose, and comprehensive explanatory frameworks, remarkably similar to those provided by religion. It was this personal observation of how disbelief functioned in practice that gave Nietzsche's philosophical insights their unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely analyzing philosophical positions academically. He was uncovering their psychological function through direct observation of their effects on human minds. As he would later write in The Antichrist, "A belief can be refuted 1,000 times, but if the man needs it, he will continue to uphold it as true." This wasn't merely critique of religious irrationality, but recognition of a psychological pattern that persists even in those who most vehemently reject religion. This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how nihilism functions psychologically. It wasn't merely a critique of religion, but a profound psychological insight into how the rejection of faith often reproduces the very structures it claims to transcend. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern? And what implications might it have for how we understand intellectual freedom, honest thinking, and the possibility of moving beyond both naive faith and naive skepticism? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of intellectual history and the psychology of atheism. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how disbelief had evolved in Western thought. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice: the systematic transformation of atheism from simple negation of religious claims into comprehensive worldviews that reproduced many psychological functions of religion. In Human, All Too Human, published in 1878, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. The free spirit, the enemy of allegory, will first need to conquer an unrestricted freedom from all previous interpretations and colorations attached to the eternal basic text of Homo Natura. Here, as in 100 other instances, freedom from is initially the only achievement a spirit is capable of. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that the initial stage of skepticism, the simple negation of established beliefs, often remains psychologically tethered to what it rejects. The atheist who proudly defines themselves by what they don't believe remains oriented around religion, merely inverting its claims rather than truly transcending its psychological structure. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying the limitations of simple negation, which others had noted before, but recognizing its psychological function. How disbelief often serves needs remarkably similar to those served by belief. The need for certainty, for comprehensive explanation, for moral purpose, for intellectual identity. These psychological requirements persist whether one embraces religion or rejects it. The content changes while the structure remains. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in the atheists of his era. Figures like Ludwig Feuerbach, David Strauss, and Auguste Comte. He noted how their rejection of traditional religion didn't lead to the absence of religious psychological structures, but to their reproduction in secular forms. Feuerbach replaced God with humanity as the object of reverence. Strauss substituted cultural achievement for divine purpose. Comte explicitly created a religion of humanity, complete with rituals, saints, and moral commandments. The pattern was consistent. The psychological functions of religion persisted even as its metaphysical claims were rejected. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's analysis of modern scientific materialism, which he saw not simply as the absence of metaphysical belief, but as a particular kind of belief system. In The Gay Science, he writes, "We see that science also rests on a faith. There simply is no science without presuppositions. The question whether truth is needed must not only have been affirmed in advance, but affirmed to such a degree that the principle, the faith, the conviction, finds expression. Nothing is needed more than truth, and in relation to it, everything else has only second-rate value." This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that even the most rigorous scientific materialism rests on unproven faith commitments, that truth is valuable, that understanding is possible, that reality is comprehensible, commitments that function psychologically in ways remarkably similar to religious faith. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how atheism often functioned emotionally and socially. He noted how frequently the rejection of religion provided psychological satisfactions remarkably similar to those provided by religion itself. The sense of intellectual superiority, moral clarity, community with fellow skeptics, and emotional comfort derived from comprehensive explanation. The pattern was consistent. Disbelief served many of the same psychological needs as belief, merely through inverted content. This observation allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that nihilism wasn't simply the absence of belief, but a particular kind of belief, a faith in nothingness that functioned psychologically in ways remarkably similar to faith in fullness. As he would later write in The Will to Power, "What does nihilism mean? That the highest values devaluate themselves. The aim is lacking. Why? Finds no answer." This isn't merely description of philosophical position, but recognition of a psychological condition. One characterized not by the absence of faith structures, but by their inversion. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across intellectual history, philosophical positions, and human psychology. The rejection of traditional faith consistently transforms not into the absence of faith structures, but into their reproduction in inverted form. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that nihilism wasn't merely a philosophical position, but a complex psychological and cultural phenomenon with distinct stages and manifestations. The simple equation of nihilism with disbelief masked a more subtle reality. Nihilism represents not the absence of belief, but a particular kind of belief crisis, one where traditional values lose their power without being replaced by new values. This isn't merely philosophical transformation, but psychological metamorphosis, with nihilism serving as transitional stage between different value systems. In notes later published as The Will to Power, Nietzsche expanded this analysis through his concept of incomplete nihilism versus complete nihilism. Incomplete nihilism involves merely rejecting traditional values without creating new ones, the stage where the old, true world has been abolished, but no new world has been posited in its place. Complete nihilism, by contrast, involves recognizing that the very structure of valuation itself is human creation rather than cosmic truth. This distinction reveals Nietzsche's recognition that most self-proclaimed nihilists remain in the incomplete stage, rejecting specific values while retaining the psychological need for absolute values, merely inverting traditional beliefs rather than truly moving beyond the structure of belief itself. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that nihilism itself follows a developmental trajectory. In The Will to Power, he outlines stages of nihilism from its initial appearance as passive nihilism, the sense that everything is meaningless, to more active forms where this recognition becomes catalyst for creation of new values. This isn't merely philosophical typology, but psychological insight into how the mind navigates the collapse of established meaning systems, moving from initial despair through various forms of compensation before potentially reaching terrain where new values become possible. Nietzsche began to see that nihilism revealed something essential about how values function psychologically, not as objective truths discovered by the intellect, but as vital necessities created by living beings. As he writes in The Gay Science, whatever has value in our world now does not have value in itself, according to its nature. Nature is always valueless, but has been given value at some time. This isn't merely metaphysical position, but profound psychological insight. Values aren't found in reality, but created through our relationship to reality, a creative process that operates whether one embraces traditional values, inverts them through nihilism, or moves beyond this opposition entirely. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights, that the proud disbelief of the nihilist often masks unacknowledged belief structures operating at deeper psychological levels. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. This isn't merely poetic warning, but psychological observation. The mind that defines itself through rejection of traditional values often unconsciously reproduces their structural features, the certainty, the moral fervor, the comprehensive explanation, merely inverting the content while maintaining the form. The pattern became increasingly clear. Nihilism functions psychologically not as the absence of belief, but as a particular stage in belief's evolution, a transitional phase where old values lose power without new values, yet emerging to replace them. During this transition, the psychological need for meaning, purpose, and comprehensive explanation remains, often leading to inverted faith structures where disbelief becomes new form of certainty and emptiness becomes new object of devotion. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the psychological power of nihilism lies precisely in its ability to provide inverted satisfaction of religious needs. As he writes in The Gay Science, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. This isn't merely observation about religious decline, but profound psychological insight. The shadow of God, the psychological structures created by centuries of religious meaning-making, persists even in minds that explicitly reject divine reality, leading to forms of atheism and nihilism that unconsciously reproduce religious psychological patterns. What implications might this understanding have for how we approach intellectual honesty, the pursuit of truth, and the possibility of thinking beyond both naive faith and naive skepticism. And what might it reveal about the possibility of values beyond the opposition of belief and disbelief? As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse domains of human experience. The psychological structure of faith wasn't isolated to traditional religion or its simple negation, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout human meaning-making. The pattern was clear: the mind's need for certainty, comprehensive explanation, and absolute values persists whether one embraces traditional faith, inverts it through nihilism, or attempts to move beyond this opposition entirely. What changes is the content of belief, not its underlying psychological structure. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. Gradually, it has become clear to me what every great philosophy has been: a personal confession of its author and a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir. This passage reveals his recognition that philosophical systems, including those most explicitly rejecting traditional metaphysics, often function psychologically as sophisticated justifications of personal temperaments and needs, rather than purely objective analyses of reality. The nihilist who confidently declares everything is meaningless is making a confession of personal psychological condition as much as a statement about external reality. The pattern revealed itself in how scientific materialism functioned psychologically. Rather than simply applying empirical methods to specific questions, materialist worldviews often expanded into comprehensive explanatory systems that made absolute claims about reality's nature, claims exceeding what empirical evidence alone could establish. The statement, "nothing exists beyond material reality," isn't scientific finding, but metaphysical position that functions psychologically in ways remarkably similar to religious metaphysics, providing comprehensive explanation and intellectual certainty that satisfies psychological needs similar to those addressed by religion. In political ideologies, the same pattern appeared. Movements explicitly rejecting religious frameworks often reproduced religious psychological structures, absolute truth claims, moral certainty, eschatological visions of future transformation, whether through revolution, technological progress, or social evolution, and heresy concepts for delegitimizing dissenting views. The pattern continued. The structure of faith persisted even in worldviews that most explicitly rejected faith's content. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in personal identity construction. Those who most proudly defined themselves through disbelief, whether as atheists, skeptics, or nihilists, often constructed identities characterized by certainty, missionary zeal, and moral indignation, remarkably similar to the religious identities they rejected. The pattern persisted. The psychological structures of faith remained even as their content inverted. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across contexts. Whether in philosophy, science, politics, or personal identity, the same psychological mechanism operated. The mind's need for certainty, comprehensive explanation, and absolute values persisted despite changes in the specific content of belief. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are." This isn't merely self-help advice, but profound psychological insight. The mind naturally constructs meaning systems that express its fundamental temperament and needs, whether through belief or disbelief. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights: that genuine intellectual freedom requires moving beyond both naive faith and naive disbelief into territory where the mind recognizes its own meaning-making activity. The proud nihilist who declares, "I believe in nothing," remains psychologically tethered to faith structures, merely inverting them rather than truly transcending them. Authentic freedom of thought emerges not from believing everything or nothing, but from recognizing how belief itself functions psychologically. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if intellectual honesty requires recognizing not just the limitations of traditional faith, but also the hidden faith structures operating within disbelief itself? What if genuine freedom of thought emerges not from believing or disbelieving, but from understanding how belief functions psychologically? What if the mind, capable of moving beyond both naive faith and naive skepticism, is one that observes reality without the comfort of absolute positions. This recognition wasn't merely an academic observation, but a profound challenge to how we understand intellectual honesty, philosophical maturity, and the possibility of genuine freedom of thought. If nihilism often functions as inverted religion, rather than its transcendence, what might become possible if we recognized this pattern? What form of thinking might emerge if we moved beyond both dogmatic belief and dogmatic disbelief into territory where the mind observes reality without needing the psychological comfort of absolute certainty? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond philosophical curiosity into the very heart of how we understand intellectual honesty, the pursuit of truth, and the possibility of genuine freedom of thought. If nihilism often functions as inverted religion rather than its transcendence, then addressing this pattern requires more than merely rejecting traditional faith. It demands recognizing how disbelief itself often reproduces the psychological structures it claims to overcome. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel represents the spirit that bears the weight of tradition, dutifully carrying established values without question. The lion represents the courage to say no to these imposed values, creating space through negation. The child represents the capacity for genuine creation, for saying yes to life beyond both acceptance and rejection of established values. This framework reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Moving beyond both naive faith and naive skepticism requires not just intellectual rejection of established beliefs, but psychological transformation that enables genuine creation beyond the opposition of belief and disbelief. The first profound implication is epistemological. If disbelief often functions psychologically as inverted belief, genuine intellectual honesty requires recognizing the faith structures operating within our most confident denials. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, there are still harmless self-observers who believe that there are immediate certainties. For example, I think, or as the superstition of Schopenhauer put it, I will. I shall repeat 100 times, we really ought to free ourselves from the seduction of words. This passage reveals his recognition that genuine intellectual honesty involves not just questioning specific beliefs, but recognizing how the very structure of believing operates within our thinking, even in our most confident rejections and denials. The second implication is psychological. If nihilism represents transitional stage between value systems rather than final philosophical position, authentic human development requires moving through rather than remaining within this transition. As Nietzsche suggests in The Will to Power, nihilism represents a pathological transitional stage, when the productive forces are not yet strong enough. This insight reveals how nihilism functions developmentally, not as destination but as passage between destruction of old values and creation of new ones. Remaining in proud disbelief often represents developmental arrest rather than intellectual achievement. The third implication is creative. If both traditional faith and its negation remain psychologically tethered to each other, authentic thinking requires moving beyond this opposition entirely into territory where new values become possible. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, what if someday or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it, and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? This thought experiment reveals how moving beyond both naive faith and naive disbelief opens possibility for fundamentally different relationship to existence, one characterized neither by belief nor disbelief, but by affirming life without needing metaphysical guarantees. Perhaps the most profound implication is liberatory. If the opposition between belief and disbelief often masks deeper psychological similarity, genuine freedom of thought requires recognizing how both often serve similar psychological functions. As Nietzsche writes in Twilight of the Idols, I mistrust all systematizers and avoid them. The will to a system is a lack of integrity. This isn't mere provocative statement, but profound insight. Systematic thinking, whether religious or anti-religious, often reflects psychological need for certainty and completeness, rather than genuine encounter with reality's complexity. What does this mean for how we approach intellectual honesty, philosophical maturity, and the possibility of genuine freedom of thought? If nihilism often functions as inverted religion rather than its transcendence, what might become possible if we recognize this pattern? What form of thinking might emerge if we moved beyond both dogmatic belief and dogmatic disbelief? As Nietzsche suggests, the path toward genuine freedom of thought begins not with more confident belief or disbelief, but with recognizing how belief itself functions psychologically, how the mind naturally constructs meaning systems that express its fundamental temperament and needs, whether through faith or its rejection. The liberation of thinking from both naive belief and naive skepticism might open possibilities for relationship to reality characterized neither by dogmatic certainty nor dogmatic doubt, but by what Nietzsche called the intellectual conscience, the capacity to observe without needing absolute positions. The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond individual psychology into what might be called a conspiracy of certainty, a collective cultural agreement to avoid the anxiety of genuine uncertainty through either belief or its systematic inversion. This isn't a conscious conspiracy in the crude sense, but rather a cultural evolution driven by the basic human psychological need for certainty, comprehensive explanation, and absolute values, needs that can be satisfied either through traditional faith or through its sophisticated negation. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the historical development of Western thought. What began as explicit religious frameworks gradually transformed into secular systems that, while rejecting specific religious content, often reproduced religious psychological structures, absolute truth claims, comprehensive explanations, moral certainties, and eschatological visions. The death of God didn't eliminate the psychological needs previously satisfied by religion, but redirected them into new channels, sometimes explicitly secular, yet functionally similar to what they replaced. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by fundamental psychological needs. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, it might be a basic characteristic of existence that those who would know it completely would perish, in which case the strength of a spirit should be measured according to how much of the truth one could still barely endure, or to put it more clearly, to what degree one would require it to be thinned down, shrouded, sweetened, blunted, falsified. This passage reveals his recognition that both belief and disbelief often function psychologically as ways of making reality bearable, as strategies for managing the anxiety that might emerge from genuine confrontation with existence without the comfort of absolute positions. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across seemingly different intellectual positions. Religious fundamentalism provides certainty through absolute faith. Scientific materialism provides certainty through absolute skepticism toward the metaphysical. Political ideologies provide certainty through comprehensive social explanations. Philosophical systems provide certainty through systematic thinking. Each domain develops its own language, but the psychological function remains consistent, managing the anxiety of uncertainty through frameworks that provide absolute positions, whether affirmative or negative. The conspiracy extends into educational systems that often prioritize correct answers over genuine questioning, media environments that reward confident positions over nuanced observations, and social dynamics that celebrate certainty over the courage to remain uncertain when certainty isn't warranted. The pattern persists. Psychological comfort through absolute positions remains dominant cultural value, whether those positions involve believing everything or nothing. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability. As traditional religious frameworks lose cultural authority in certain contexts, the same psychological mechanism continues through secular forms: scientific certainty, political dogmatism, philosophical systematizing, or proud nihilism. Different language, same psychological function. managing the anxiety of uncertainty through frameworks that provide absolute positions. This recognition reveals something profound about Western psychology, that it often continues the same patterns of certainty-seeking while changing only the surface content. The person who confidently declares, "There is absolutely no God," is engaging in essentially the same psychological mechanism as the person who declares, "There is absolutely a God," managing the anxiety of uncertainty through adoption of absolute position, merely inverting the content while maintaining the psychological structure. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that nihilism often functions as inverted religion, but that both belief and disbelief often serve the same psychological function, providing refuge from the anxiety of genuine uncertainty. The real conspiracy isn't any particular doctrine, but the deeper cultural pattern of avoiding genuine uncertainty through frameworks that provide absolute positions, whether affirmative or negative. This pattern raises profound questions about human psychology, cultural evolution, and the possibility of genuine freedom of thought. If we've been collectively engaged in managing the anxiety of uncertainty through either belief or its sophisticated negation, what might become possible if we consciously recognize this pattern? What form of thinking might emerge if we valued the courage to remain uncertain when certainty isn't warranted as highly as we value the comfort of absolute positions? Why has the psychological similarity between extreme skepticism and religious faith remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound implications for intellectual honesty? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective psychological investment in the opposition between belief and disbelief. Addressing this pattern would mean questioning not just specific intellectual positions, but the very structure of how we seek psychological comfort through absolute certainty, a prospect simultaneously liberating and terrifying. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. This passage reveals his recognition that beliefs persist not primarily because of their truth value, but because of their psychological utility, and few psychological mechanisms are more useful than those that provide certainty in an uncertain existence, whether through belief or its sophisticated negation. Atheist and skeptical communities have an obvious stake in maintaining the perception that disbelief represents complete break from religious psychology rather than its partial reproduction in inverted form. Acknowledging the faith structures operating within disbelief would undermine the identity and moral clarity often derived from positioning oneself against religion. It's not that atheists consciously suppress this insight, but rather that their psychological investment in being different from believers depends on maintaining the opposition between faith and reason, rather than recognizing their potential structural similarities. Religious institutions similarly benefit from portraying atheism as completely alien to faith, rather than its psychological mirror. By framing disbelief as absolute other rather than inverted same, religious frameworks maintain clearer boundaries and stronger identity formation. The recognition that nihilism might represent not the absence of religion, but religion's shadow would complicate the opposition between belief and disbelief that structures much religious identity. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by consistently portraying believers and skeptics as fundamentally opposed, rather than potentially similar in psychological structure. From educational frameworks that present faith and reason as natural enemies, to political discourses that position religious and secular worldviews as inherently conflicting, dominant cultural stories often celebrate precisely those aspects of the belief-disbelief opposition that mask deeper psychological similarities. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of cultural systems that benefit from the psychological comfort provided by clear oppositions. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because addressing it would mean confronting what Nietzsche called the death of God in its fullest implications, not merely rejecting specific religious beliefs, but recognizing how the psychological needs previously satisfied by religion continue to operate within seemingly secular frameworks. This prospect is so psychologically challenging that many prefer the comfort of absolute positions, whether religious or anti-religious, to the more demanding terrain of thinking beyond this opposition entirely. The pattern persists not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for certainty over ambiguity, for absolute positions over nuanced observations, and for the comfort of systematic frameworks over the challenge of genuine uncertainty. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What is new, however, is always evil, being that which wants to conquer and overthrow the old boundary markers and the old pieties. And only what is old is good. The good men are in all ages those who dig the old thoughts, digging deep and getting them to bear fruit, the farmers of the spirit. But eventually, all land is exploited, and the plowshare of evil must come again and again." This passage reveals his recognition that moving beyond established patterns of thinking, including the opposition between belief and disbelief, represents psychological challenge that many naturally resist. What does this mean for the possibility of genuine intellectual honesty and freedom of thought? If we've been collectively engaged in managing the anxiety of uncertainty through either belief or its sophisticated negation, what might become possible if we consciously recognize this pattern? What form of thinking might emerge if we valued the courage to remain uncertain when certainty isn't warranted as highly as we value the comfort of absolute positions? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of thinking beyond both dogmatic belief and dogmatic disbelief, not through finding more sophisticated certainties, but through developing what he called the intellectual conscience, the capacity to observe without needing absolute positions. The final question isn't whether to believe or disbelieve, but whether to recognize how both often function as sophisticated strategies for avoiding the anxiety of genuine uncertainty. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about human psychology. Our tendency to seek refuge from uncertainty through frameworks that provide absolute positions, whether affirmative or negative. But it also reveals something even more significant, the possibility of thinking beyond this opposition entirely. A mode of consciousness that neither believes nor disbelieves but observes reality without needing the psychological comfort of certainty. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the child, the final metamorphosis of spirit beyond both the burden-bearing camel and the rejecting lion. The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-rolling wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. This isn't mere poetic language, but profound psychological insight. Genuine freedom of thought emerges not from believing everything or nothing, but from capacity to engage reality with curiosity and creativity beyond the opposition of faith and skepticism. This isn't about embracing relativism or abandoning the pursuit of truth, but transforming how we relate to uncertainty itself, moving from framework that treats uncertainty as problem requiring solution to one that recognizes uncertainty as essential condition for genuine thinking. Perhaps intellectual maturity isn't measured by how confidently you believe or disbelieve, but by how honestly you can observe reality without needing the psychological comfort of absolute positions. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "We conserve nothing. Neither do we want to return to any past periods. We are not by any means liberal. We do not work for progress. We do not need to plug up our ears against the sirens who in the marketplace sing of the future, their song about equal rights, a free society, no more masters and no servants has no allure for us." What might this look like in practice? It means examining your relationship to certainty, noticing when you embrace absolute positions not because evidence genuinely warrants them, but because they provide psychological comfort in an uncertain existence. It means asking whether your skepticism genuinely emerges from careful observation or from psychological need to position yourself against particular beliefs. It means recognizing when you use phrases like, "I know for certain," or "that's definitely not true," to manage the anxiety of uncertainty rather than to express genuine knowledge. It means developing relationship to uncertainty that neither flees from it through dogmatic belief nor through equally dogmatic disbelief, but rather embraces it as essential condition for genuine thinking. Scientific inquiry not as path to absolute certainty, but as method for refining observations while maintaining appropriate tentativeness. philosophical reflection, not as quest for systematic completion, but as ongoing questioning that remains open to revision. Spiritual exploration, not as search for final answers, but as engagement with life's fundamental mysteries beyond both naive faith and naive skepticism. Most importantly, it means recognizing that the mind capable of moving beyond both dogmatic belief and dogmatic disbelief isn't one that has found some new certainty, but one that has developed comfort with uncertainty itself, what Nietzsche called the intellectual conscience, the capacity to observe without needing absolute positions. This isn't arbitrary relativism, but recognition that genuine engagement with reality often requires the courage to remain uncertain when certainty isn't warranted. The path forward isn't about finding more sophisticated certainties, but developing greater comfort with uncertainty itself. Whether within traditional intellectual frameworks or beyond them, genuine freedom of thought requires recognizing how both belief and disbelief often function as sophisticated strategies for avoiding the anxiety of genuine uncertainty, and developing the courage to think beyond this opposition entirely. What might become possible if you stopped seeking refuge in either belief or disbelief and started developing comfort with uncertainty itself? What insights might emerge if you distinguished between productive uncertainty and mere confusion? What form of consciousness might you discover if you separated genuine observation from the psychological need for absolute positions? The answer to these questions won't come from more confident beliefs or disbeliefs, but from the courage to recognize how belief itself functions psychologically, and to develop what Nietzsche called the intellectual conscience, the capacity to observe without needing the comfort of certainty. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the strength of a person's spirit would then be measured by how much truth he could endure, or more precisely, to what extent he needs to have it diluted, disguised, sweetened, muted, falsified. This isn't celebration of self-deception, but recognition that genuine intellectual honesty involves acknowledging the limits of human certainty and developing the courage to think beyond both naive faith and naive skepticism. The real journey isn't becoming more certain, but becoming more honest about uncertainty itself. Perhaps, as Nietzsche discovered, the most liberated thinker isn't one who believes everything or nothing, but one who observes reality without needing the psychological comfort of absolute positions, recognizing that emptiness, too, can become a god for those who need something to worship.